The sword has influenced the outcome of great moments in history, inspired famous myths and legends, and the skill of its makers has turned it into an object of desire. It's a perfect fusion of form and function, and it has the power to thrill and appall in equal measure. Today, there are many reminders of our sword-fighting past. A man buttons his coat left over right, leaving his right hand free to draw his sword. We shake hands to show we're not armed. A gentleman escorts a lady by the right arm because his sword hangs on his left. With a touch of a sword, a man is knighted. With a breaking of his own, he is disgraced. Whole armies were surrendered by the giving up of a single sword. And swords have been ritually sacrificed to the gods in order to invoke their protection. Compared to many wild animals, we're defenseless creatures. So from the earliest times, we've had to make weapons that cut and pierce in order to hunt, to eat, and for defense against enemies. The first weapons were made of flint, honed by flaking, using antler or bone to create a good cutting edge. The first known metal was gold, but it's always been precious and usually belonged to royalty. The first metal to be used for making tools and weapons was discovered 6,000 years ago. That was copper. This is the Great Orme copper mine in North Wales. It was one of the largest industrial centres of antiquity. Around 3,500 years ago, copper was exported from here to Northern Europe and the Mediterranean. A copper sword was a top-of-the-range weapon, but it had its drawbacks. Copper is soft, but when it's mixed with tin, it becomes bronze. Bronze is 3 times stronger than copper and is more suitable for casting. This enabled swords of a similar quality to be produced in greater numbers. Those who controlled the production of bronze controlled their territory. In Cornwall, Neil Burridge, an expert bronze caster, has set up a forge in a Celtic roundhouse. He's heating up a mixture of approximately 90% copper and 10% tin to make bronze for a new blade. He makes bronze swords, like this 3,000-year-old example from the Royal Armouries in Leeds. This caster's technique is based on archaeological evidence. Like most sword makers, he judges the metal by eye, and the color of the molten bronze is crucial in deciding when it's ready to pour. It solidifies almost immediately. The famous legend of King Arthur and the sword in the stone may have its roots in this process, where we see the newly cast sword removed from a stone mold. Cooling the metal by quenching it in water also makes it harder and ready for action. The sword, unlike the spear or arrow, is a close-range weapon. That's what makes it so special, so personal, and so terrible. In much of Northern Europe, the tribal system of fighting put great emphasis on individual bravery, but tactics and a coordinated approach to a battle was seldom adopted. But whatever system of fighting was used, there were still problems with swords. Bronze, though tougher than copper, could still deform in the intensity of a fight. It took hundreds of years for new materials, knowledge and skill to cross the continent. With the discovery and exploitation of iron in 1500 BC in Central Asia, warriors had a harder material with which to make their weapons. The sword was still evolving along with metallurgy. Iron is much more abundant than copper, and more widely distributed across the world. It could be forged into much sharper and more lethal weapons. Swords became longer and heavier, but few remain from the early Iron period because they're prone to rust. Here's a rare example made in Western Europe. It shows a high level of decoration and may have been made as a gift for a tribal chief. Sword makers were highly regarded. Smiths who made instruments meant to take life and who transformed raw material seemed to have power over nature.
So if you manipulated the four elements of earth, air, fire and water, you were empowered by the gods to manipulate a fifth element, magic.
A swordsmith often worked in a forge whose entrance was shaped in a spiral to keep the light out. The colors of orange, red and white would be read by the swordmaker like a special code.
The blacksmith would work from these colors, and he would work so that nobody could see what he was doing because he would be blocking it out. The only person that would have these secrets would be his son or his apprentice, and they would be passed on and jealously guarded.
Swords were thought to have spiritual powers beyond their earthly use, and even went on to the afterlife. They were often buried with their owners in special places.
There are many examples of Celtic graves where the warriors are dug up with their blades folded so that they can't be used, but if in the other world they needed them, the warriors could always unbend them. The sword was bent so that a mere mortal couldn't use it.
The Celts invoked the power of lake goddesses to assist them in battle by giving up their swords as sacrificial offerings. When the Romans invaded Britain in 43 AD, they didn't underestimate the influence of the spirit world on their enemy. The strength and power of iron was exploited by the Romans more successfully than any other civilization. The Romans used new ideas and technologies to such advantage that they dominated the known world for centuries.
The real essence of Roman success was discipline and collective skills. I mean, the Roman legionary fought as part of a team. He fought as part of a team which was well organized in tactical terms and had also got great logistic backup. I mean, he was a soldier rather than an individual warrior.
And around the middle of the 1st century AD, the Roman soldier was to benefit from two significant changes in equipment: bands of plate armor with mail, and a sturdier cut and thrust sword made from steel. Both were very effective against their enemies. Romans trained hard. They even practiced with wooden swords, something that their dangerous entertainers, the gladiators, used to do. Here's some rarely seen footage of Hollywood actor Kirk Douglas in rehearsal for the epic film Spartacus, the story of a rebel gladiator.
A motion picture unequaled in the entire history of filmmaking, unlikely ever to be surpassed. Slave, gladiator, invincible fighter.
This film inspired Sue Shadrach, who's now an expert on gladiators.
The whole word gladiator comes from the name for the sword. This is a gladius. Every gladiator takes their name from the primary weapon that they use.
Gladiators have always pulled in the crowds. They were better trained than the average soldier. They were expensive, super pros, and some of their training was adopted by the Roman army. There are even accounts of female fighters.
There were female gladiators, and they were by no means as common as the male variety, a novelty. And I think that because it was so shocking, it was a difficult thing for people to take in. But we have records of high-born women who chose to go into the arena. When we hear about these people, we've got to remember these women were the exception, very much the exception.
In total, the Roman army had 30 legions of 5,000 men each. They also had as many auxiliary troops recruited from the subjects of the empire.
With this, they conquered so many nations, so this was the thing that brought them their riches, their fame, their reputation, and it's always been the weapon that's defined Rome itself.
When Emperor Claudius invaded Britain, he brought 40,000 troops with him, 15% of the entire army, and it took 20 difficult years to defeat the natives. The accounts of the terrifying fighting methods of the Celts were written up by the Roman scribe Tacitus. Each Briton behaved according to his character. Unarmed men were prepared to charge to certain death. Even the vanquished now and then recovered their fury and their courage. In their desperate plight, the enemy would show such bravery that when their front ranks had fallen, those immediately behind would stand on their bodies and continue to fight. This is Tacitus talking up the Celts to make the Romans look good. Despite the propaganda, there is no doubting the Celts' willingness to fight. But the Celts had to face the best sword in the business.
The Romans adopted what really became the classic infantry short sword, double-edged, designed to be used by a partially armoured man fighting in rank and file. He didn't want to swing it very far, and ideally the Roman legionary was going to use it in combination with an oblong shield covering his left side, and he'd use it for the thrust. And some Roman swords have got specially hardened tips designed to cope with the opponents of Rome. A very, very effective fighting sword.
Most of the Roman army were infantry. They used chariots for ceremonial and sporting events. Cavalry were only used for reconnaissance and harassing fleeing enemy soldiers. Mounted Roman troops didn't use stirrups, but that was to change. In 378 AD, two-thirds of the Eastern Roman army was wiped out by the Visigoths, who used the stirrup and massed cavalry charges.
The introduction of the stirrup, which came in gradually from the east, made it easier for the very heavily armoured and equipped horseman to use his horse as a battle platform, with his feet thrust deeply into stirrups, riding with almost a straight leg and sitting in a great big chair-like saddle. There he was, secure in the saddle and able to use a variety of heavy swords and battle axes and war hammers, really comparatively securely. So from that point of view, the stirrup and the heavy sword went hand in hand.
The Romans in Britain moved out to defend their territory in the east. Their western provinces then became vulnerable. Germanic and Scandinavian tribes invaded Britain. Jutes, Angles and Saxons settled amongst the newly Christianized British and overran most of the native population. These pagan invaders had to be resisted, and one of the greatest heroes of all time was created, Arthur, the once and future king, a figure that was part historical, part mythological. In the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth took hold of the original Welsh myth and combined it with own animation to create a best-selling Latin text, The History of the Kings of Britain. The stories spread into the French-speaking world, making Arthur and his knights the stuff of the European imagination, even rivaling heroes like Charlemagne. The early Celtic themes, such as the story in which Arthur proves his rightful succession as king by drawing the sword from the stone, are woven into the continental stories. Later English authors claimed that the sword from the stone was broken in combat by a Welsh knight, Pellinore. Arthur was saved from certain death by Merlin, who cast a spell on Pellinore. Soon after, Arthur, who had a regard for Pellinore's sword-fighting skills, invited him to join the famous Round Table. Then Merlin took Arthur to a secret place, where the Lady of the Lake magically presented him with a new sword. Arthur was told that his future would be bound to the sword for all the days of his life. This was Excalibur. Arthur was mortally wounded after the Battle of Camlan, and he instructed Sir Bedivere to return Excalibur to the lake. Bedivere was unable to part with the sword, fearing what the future held without Arthur and Excalibur. On the third attempt, he obeyed Arthur's wish and relinquished the sword.
Excalibur is a classic example of the way that swords were used in myth and legend. The idea of a sword belonging to the once and future king. The idea of a sword which was not only important in that king's lifetime, but had, in a sense, to be committed back to whence it came. I think that's a very resonant idea, that the sword wasn't left behind after the great man had gone. The sword went after him, so that when he reappeared in a time of great need, he'd have the mighty sword to hand.
In the late 8th century, there was a new threat from the north. Vikings began to raid the coast of Britain and Western Europe. For the Viking, the sword was the principal weapon. Its value was considered so great that it was handed down from father to son. If the sword was old or belonged to a famous warrior from the past, then it would have even greater value. Magnus Sigurdsson, a swordsmith based in North Wales, makes historical weapons and knows about the qualities needed in a good blade.
Steel is either hard and breaks or soft and bends. A sword actually needs to be hard to keep a good working edge. It also needs to be soft and pliable to actually take the shock of combat and sort of parrying and actually the physical force of a blow. So a sword is a contradiction in terms. Speaking in metal, which is why they were always so expensive and such hard work to make.
Magnus is going to compare a Viking type of sword with one from the Bronze Age. We'll see how much difference over 1,000 years of technological development has made to the cutting power of the weapons. The first to be tested is the bronze sword. This is 3,000-year-old technology. Magnus is testing the sword on the carcass of a heifer. That's a nasty 8 centimeters cut, but it's not very deep.
What we have here is a Viking style sword, 8th, 9th century, but the blade design carried on to the 13th, 14th century, primarily a slashing weapon. Thank you.
The carcass is almost cut in two, proof that swords made from steel are more devastatingly effective than those made from earlier materials. Vikings revered their swords and gave them names like Gramr, fierce one, Mjolnir, decorated one, Fatbeater, biter of legs. The Norsemen of northern France, the Normans, invaded England in 1066. Their Viking-style swords were pattern welded from soft iron twisted with steel to make them both strong and flexible. The Normans took control of England and Wales. Within 100 years, a new sword culture developed, one based on romantic notions. Inspired by the legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, the sword's status was enhanced by the development of the chivalric code, a guide to acting with courage and honor, which united knights across Europe.
In the Middle Ages, the sword became particularly associated with the knight. Its Christian symbolism was also quite obvious, and the gesture of saluting by bringing the sword hilt to your lips, which is still done, really is a reflection of the age when the sword wasn't simply a knightly symbol, but reflected Christianity as well.
The Crusades were seen as the pursuit of a pure ideal. They identified the knight as a virtuous champion, one who was destined to fight in wars as a soldier of the church. The Crusades were also a battle between the cross-shaped broadsword of Christianity and the crescent-shaped scimitar of Islam. The Royal Armouries in Leeds has one of the finest sword collections in the world. It is the guardian of the British National Collection of Arms and Armour, and the museum is dedicated to the display and interpretation of military objects. The Royal Armouries also celebrates innovative design, fine craftsmanship, and advances in technology. Medieval smiths saw the transition from chainmail to plate armour as a response to developments in infantry weapons, such as mail-piercing arrows. Shields, too, were gradually made redundant by full armour and began to disappear from the battlefield, at least for knights. By the late 14th century, a technical rivalry was developing between swordsmiths and armourers.
Armour impacts on sword design just as the sword impacts on armour. What happens is you have that classic two-way relationship between attack and defence. To start with, chain armour or reinforced leather armour was widely used, and that could often be penetrated by a sharp point, which essentially wedged open the links in the armourers responded by plate armour, which was more difficult to penetrate. So swords got heavier, and swordsmiths looked at producing robust blades with edges that might be able to work at places like the shoulders. So armour got heavier. So there's this two-way relationship, with swordsmiths always thinking about getting through armour, and armourers always looking at ways of defeating first the point and then the edge.
By the 15th century, plate armour was impressive to look at, but what was it like in action? At the Royal Armouries there are international jousting events that put it to the test. Tournaments began as contests between teams of knights. Though there were casualties, the idea was not to spill much blood. It was meant to provide additional training for a knight, but the stakes were high. Knights on the losing side were taken as prisoners and ransomed. Fortunes could be made in this way. After jousting, knights would often continue fighting on foot. They used two-handed great swords. At tournaments, a fixed number of blows would be agreed beforehand, and knights would take it in turns to hit their opponent. The sword was used as a virtual club. On the battlefield, the two-handed sword was used to smash through armour. It looked heavier than it was, but nevertheless, it required considerable skill in action. Just how great a risk an armoured knight faced is answered by Dutchman Arne Koits, who wears a mighty eagle helm in tournaments.
Even if the visor is shut, you would try and stab through there with the sword, because it's a very big inroad into the brain. If the visor is open, so a knight can see more, then of course you have a bigger target. Depending on the type of helmet, the risk might be the front of the throat or the side of the neck. The armpits are very important. They are a main target. There's chainmail under there, but with a good thrust you can get through the mail and get into the lungs and the heart and other body parts.
Ease of movement must be a problem.
Plate armour does actually allow you a lot of movement. For example, you can raise your hands right up there. I can actually touch the far side of my head, and I can bring my arms right across. There are all sorts of moves you might use with a sword too. The waist is actually made so that I can make a lot of movement, like this. I can actually lunge with all this armour. The plates will fold and they'll concertina to allow me to do this. The sabretons on the feet, the knees, everything is articulated, even the top of the legs. This is to enable me to raise them because the movements involved are vital.
Dus daardoor heb je eigenlijk alle bewegelijkheid die je nodig hebt om te kunnen vechten te voet.
Face to face with the enemy was no picnic.
What you then had was, in essence, bloody murder. You had two well-trained, heavily armoured men hacking at one another. So we ought not to confuse the knight's chivalrous background with the ghastly nature of what big men with big swords could actually do to one another.
Medieval warfare involved butchery on a large scale. The sword was the knight's main weapon, and it caused death from stabbing, bleeding, and infection too. Swords were rarely clean, and contaminated blades probably did as much damage as a sharp point. There are those today who still want to fight like medieval knights. In Hammerstein, North Germany, there's an unique sword-fighting event, an international gathering of martial arts enthusiasts who come together to do battle in the style of the early 15th century. The contest is sponsored by Welsh company Knights Gone By. They supply weapons and costume for battle reenactment from all periods, but specialize in the Middle Ages. Some of the action is held at the local leisure centre. These fighters are using steel swords and small shields called bucklers. This is a competition, not a demonstration. This is tough stuff, but there have to be some safeguards.
There was a level of risk tolerance and injury tolerance back then that we simply can't accept nowadays. And the winner of the match was the one who struck his opponent and trying to inflict a bleeding wound. So when you have a culture that breeds fencers who are used to that level of intensity, of competition, you're going to see certain skill levels, I think, that we're probably never going to attain. But in terms of getting close, as close as we can, in terms of actually carrying out the techniques in a combative situation and making them work, I think we're getting pretty close to that.
Judges are looking for a number of qualities that range from attitude to technique.
They're primarily looking to see a swordsman who displays dominance over his opponent. They're looking for a swordsman who can step in and strike his opponent a clean blow and then escape untouched. There's an old saying from fencing, and that fencing is the art of touching without being touched. You are so focused on your opponent, watching every little move, planning out what you're going to do next, that there's no time for fear. It's a very delicate balance between being ready to go, ready to really snap into action, but have that under tight control until that exact moment when, bang, you step in and you strike your opponent.
The event is partly based at Baron von Hammerstein's castle near Hanover, a Gothic and inspirational setting for the contest. The fighters don't have a lot of protection from blows, but then they're not exactly trying to kill each other. When he's not judging at Hammerstein, Alex Kiermeier is chasing villains in Munich. He's a cop, but he's been interested in swords a long time.
Ja, ich bin interessiert eigentlich seit...
I've been keen on sword fighting since childhood, at least from the age of 10 years old through to my teenage years.
Der Schwertkampf begann mich eigentlich so vor 10 bis 15 Jahren zu interessieren. Es war vor allem durch verschiedene Filme...
Really, we just took sticks and fought wildly with no technique. I think this is the same all over the world.
Ziemlich planlos, wie ich zugeben muss. Und ja, ich denke, es ist das Gleiche überall auf der Welt.
The competitors have an academic interest in swords.
Ja, ich denke, das ist eines der wichtigsten Dinge, die wir beachten müssen.
The most important thing we do is to look at historical sources. We don't want just to attack each other in a brutal way.
Zusammenzustellen und nicht einfach nur die Schwerter aufeinander zu schlagen. Es fühlt sich einfach...
It feels good to use a sword correctly.
Für mich steht es vor allem für Kontrolle.
For me, it's all about controlling my ego, controlling the opponent and the distance between us, and not to lose my overall game plan.
Kontrollieren und auch den Abstand zwischen uns.
Some of the oldest manuscripts which illustrate sword-fighting moves were produced in Germany. There are examples from the 13th century. They depict what appear to be monks, but are probably ex-soldiers who had retired to monasteries and wanted to record their sword-fighting skills. The man in armor is Frenchman Philippe Guillon, a martial arts expert who is also judging here.
I've always been interested in martial arts, but medieval manuscripts have only been available for the last 10 or 12 years on the internet and other digital sources. There are guides available in Italian and German, and I'm studying the medieval master, Sigmund Ringegg, who is from the longsword tradition. Medieval fencing is technically difficult. We can recreate it as closely as possible, but in an event like ours, emotions run high. The intense desire to compete sometimes gets in the way of correct sword fighting of the medieval period.
They don't only use steel here. Bamboo swords, some clad in black leather, also pack a punch. Some of the women pack a punch too. Iris van Dam from Holland is keen to fight the men.
Het trekt mij aan omdat ik op de middelbare school moest ik een act.
Sword fighting attracted me because in high school I had to choose performance art. Everybody did juggling and some even tried the monocycle. But I and a friend chose sword fighting. We found a place through the internet. We went along and met these guys. They had really long hair. They were big and scary, but they turned out to be really sweet.
Ik was een beetje bang, maar het bleken hele lieve mannen te zijn, heel aardig. Het is soms zwaar om tegen iemand te vechten die sterker is en misschien ook wel sneller.
Sometimes it's difficult to fight someone who's stronger or got a better technique. But in training things are gentler and then it's not so dangerous.
Het is niet gevaarlijk, het is gewoon rustig. Hier in het gevecht in de wedstrijd.
Here in competition it's tougher, but I've got a good technique and sometimes I win, but sometimes I lose. I don't always have the strength to keep my guard up.
En daardoor verlies ik af en toe, maar het gaat best goed. Ik heb een goede gevecht gehad.
Would she consider modern fencing?
Ik ben in het begin in contact gekomen met...
In the beginning I thought about fencing, but the skills are so different. For me, fencing is a bit weird. There's too much jumping back and then forwards. Also, fencing is more about thrusting than hitting your opponent hard.
Ik ben de plaatsen echt aan het slaan en dus, dat is de reden.
Whatever the protection, there's usually a way through, especially when the armor used isn't custom made. This competitor has just had his wrist cut open. The paramedic sorted him out in the end. In the finals, it was Israel versus Germany. The tall man in white is the Israeli. Alex Brainin from Israel took the longsword prize.
I enjoy the fight. I enjoy the history too. It has a long legacy. And it's cool to have people just returning to their roots a little and not just doing katana and kenjutsu and Japanese things. We're European. We should do European things.
The prize is a broadsword made and presented by Magnus Sigurdsson on behalf of the sponsors. Fine swords have always been desirable. This is an Italian sword called the Cinque Dea, so called because it's 5 fingers wide at the top of the blade. It's based on medieval types of swords that were used to lever open plate armor. In the 16th century, they were used by Italians for adornment, often hung in a scabbard, slung along the lower back and buttocks. The quality of the steel in this example is not the finest. Some of the best swords of all time were produced in the Far East. For over 1,000 years, one blade dominated the battlefields of Japan, the katana, used by samurai warriors. This is where the legendary katana is born. This furnace will burn for 3 days and nights. It is fed by iron reduced to a sand-like form. The iron is incredibly pure, and it forms a unique steel once it has combined with the carbon from the charcoal flakes. The raw steel is tamahagani.
After an hour, the iron sand sinks to the bottom to the bed of fire. When we look at the bed of fire, we can see from the colour whether or not it has become tamahagani.
The furnace man tends the flames day and night until the process is complete.
The furnace is like a woman, and we can think of the iron coal as food. We feed her, and she consumes it, so that she will produce good tamahagani.
The carbon provides shock absorption to withstand huge punishment when fighting.
The samurai, the warrior and gentleman of Japan, was defined by the two swords that he wore. He wore a long sword called the katana and a short sword called a wakizashi. And almost no one else in Japanese society was allowed to wear a sword. And so the wearing of a pair of swords became a way of advertising that you were a samurai, that you were a man of a particular breeding, particular background. And the long sword, the katana, this gently curved, very simple blade, was more than simply one of the most effective fighting weapons ever designed. It was something that went to the very center of the samurai ethos. It was, as it was put at the time, the soul of the samurai.
After 3 days, the special tamahagani steel is drawn from the furnace. The swordsmith leads a spiritual way of life. He prays to Buddha for a perfect sword. The forge is regarded as a sacred site. In all countries with a martial tradition, the sword has been elevated to a symbol of power and justice. But in Japan, it's more than this. The samurai's spiritual development was achieved through the way of the sword. The tamahagani is covered in paper with the holy script. Then a light covering of clay and ash are added to limit the amount of air in the process. The hammering welds all the pieces into one and drives out impurities. The katana is now a block of steel, but then it is folded. A dozen folds creates over 5,000 layers of steel.
In most cultures, the smith has an important role. I mean, he's the man who is putting into the sword more than simply practical qualities. He's imbuing it with something of himself. He will very often make the process of forging the sword quasi-religious. He'll sign it with pride, so much so that good swordsmiths often had their signatures counterfeited, almost like good artists might. In Japanese society, this takes a very extreme form, and the smith would abstain from drink and from sex and would almost become a monk for the period of forging the sword. And the sword would have in it all sorts of qualities, and it was said that a particularly famous Japanese swordsmith would always make swords that had a particular thirst for blood. He was a skilled smith, but his swords somehow were evil.
Samurai warriors were an elite class. Their particular Buddhist belief meant they had no fear of killing or dying. Raids on Korea and China gained riches for the warlords of medieval Japan. The katana sword brought wealth. It was a blade of distinction.
With the Japanese sword, you have a little irregular wavy line at the edge, and that reflects the fact that actually it too is layer upon layer of steel, beaten, heated, beaten again, giving quite extraordinary strength and durability to the blade, but also sharpness at its cutting edge.
Katanas were made from 2 kinds of steel, hard on the outside but with a softer core to give toughness and flexibility. In the Middle Ages, katanas were used in executions, but they were also tested on the corpses of criminals. Swords were graded according to their cutting power. One of the final stages is the polishing process. The task is to sharpen the sword and to reveal the structures or grain that were built into the sword during the making process. Eventually, the beauty of the metal shines through, and hard and soft layers are revealed. The samurai was always close to his sword. At night it remained by his bed. It was a sign of his authority, and only death would part him from it. But which is superior, the Japanese katana or a medieval broadsword from the same period? The katana is light and enables the swordsman to move and cut quickly. The broadsword is heavier, but just as sharp. By the time the katana has made 3 cuts, the broadsword will only cut once. This sword may be made today, but it embodies centuries of knowledge. While the samurai were at their most powerful, Europe was entering the Age of Enlightenment. In the West, the Renaissance of the 15th century brought about a new age of learning. Between 1450 and 1500, more books were produced than in the previous 1,000 years. The development of printing allowed experts to reach a wide audience. The publication of guides to sword fighting proved popular. It wasn't long before these ideas were exploited by the theatre. Shakespeare took his fencing seriously. There are over 400 references to swords in Shakespeare's plays. Stratford, the home of the Royal Shakespeare Company, regularly puts on the great bard's plays. Film and stage actor Matthew Rhys has played a lead role in several Shakespeare productions.
Within the 3 productions that I did there, the 3 different styles of fighting were completely different. The Macbeth, for example, we used samurai swords. The Romeo was very true to its time. We used rapiers. And then the Edgar Edmund fight, we used broadswords. I think the true mark of a good fight arranger, fight director, is they will think how the characters would fight. It's not just about devising a good fight, but how each individual character would fight. So Edmund, for example, who's very devious, sinister, had a very nasty style of fighting, cheating and underhand tactics, whereas, you know, Romeo the romantic is upright and sort of beautiful footwork.
Hollywood actor Johan Griffith, who starred as Lancelot in Touchstone Pictures' King Arthur, recalls his stage fight training.
The swordmaster at RIDDLE would always remind us that we were never in any sort of neutral pose whilst the sword had been withdrawn. You were always sort of on guard, as it were, you know, prepared. So there was never a moment where you would relax the sword in any way. Everything was, you had a focus and a purpose, and being in a state of readiness, you know, to receive a parry or get ready to riposte.
Dangers must be considerable.
It's very dangerous, as I'm not sure if you can see, as I can prove, and that's with a blunt sword.
Actors in Shakespeare's time had to prove themselves to their audiences, who knew all about sword fighting. They would try to join in until swords were banned from the auditorium. Shakespeare enjoyed action as well as words, and so the Royal Shakespeare Company's creative workshops continued to design and restore the arms and armour essential to its productions. Julian Gilbert, the company armourer, has been with the RSC for 25 years, and his sword collection is a favourite with fight directors. Weapons and props from this armory are not only seen on stage, but in the cinema too. Feature films like Gladiator, Braveheart and Elizabeth have used the Royal Shakespeare Company armory to equip its stars. Shakespeare's audiences craved violence. They knew all about bear baiting, bull baiting, cockfights and duels to the death. Actors, though, had to fence safely in order to do it nightly. Animal bladders would be filled with sheep's blood and squeezed to feign a wound. In his stores, Julian has many props to help tell a story. In the theatre, just like film, sound is important in conveying authenticity. The swords on stage have to sound like the real thing.
Yes, these are from the type that Matthew Rhys would have used in a production of Romeo and Juliet and King Lear. And this is an interesting one because it's made from an aluminium alloy and it sounds absolutely beautiful when struck. It's a really nice ring. But unfortunately you can't use the alloy sword against the steel sword. It has to be used against itself. Otherwise the steel sword will literally cut straight through this alloy one.
Shakespeare learned to fence in Blackfriars Theatre. He was taught by an Italian, Vincenzio Saviolo. At the time, the sword was still the weapon of choice in a fight. The sword was soon to bow to a new and terrible weapon. Gunpowder had been invented by the Chinese in the 9th century and was originally used by the artillery. By the 16th century, it had been developed and used in handheld muskets.
The development of gunpowder weapons had a huge effect on the whole of warfare. It meant that armour was really going to disappear. It meant that although hand-to-hand fighting would continue, and swords were going to be used even by infantry for a bit afterwards and by cavalry for quite a long time afterwards, actually most of the damage was going to be done by bullets. So once gunpowder has brought its noisy, bad egg stink fury to the battlefield, the days of the sword are numbered.